right, guys, this new unit is called Intro to the Horror Genre. And in this unit, we're going to focus on reading scary short stories and really paying attention to different techniques that the authors use in those stories to make them suspenseful and sometimes a little bit scary. And so the first thing we're going to focus on is a short section from this novel called The Girl from the Well. And we're going to be paying particular attention to, especially this week, the idea of suspense. And we're going to be trying to identify different techniques that the author uses in that book in order to build suspense for the readers. Well, before we get started, I do just want to kind of remind you all what suspense is. And so in horror stories, authors rely on suspense to heighten the tension in the story and really engage the readers. So through suspense, readers are really feeling anxiety, curiosity, and interest about what's going to happen next in the story. If you've ever watched a scary movie, that is what this entire movie is all about, is building that suspense by making us feel kind of on the edge of our seat about the things that may happen to the characters in the movie. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a video clip from this quote-unquote scary movie called A Quiet Place that came out in 2018. Ultimately, I don't think this movie is scary, but I do think that the producers and the director of this movie did a really good job at trying to build the suspense. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the clip. And as I show the clip, I want you to be thinking about what are some suspense building techniques that you think the movie producer and director have done in this clip in order to keep us on the edge of our seat and interest us in what is happening. And so you want to be paying attention to the characters, the things you see, and the things that you hear. All right. So as you could see in that video clip, not super scary, but it's very clear that the director and producers worked hard in order to make that a suspenseful moment in the movie. So I want to talk about the things that I noticed. So the first thing I noticed was sights. I noticed that the setting of this video clip took place at night, in the dark, in a cornfield, in an area since I have background knowledge on the video, in an area that is very isolated. Those were all intentional choices made by the creators of this movie in order to make us feel suspense. And that's because we know that things tend to be scarier at night. And when we hear all of those little sounds that are happening, in addition to the silence, we're sort of knowing that something's coming, but we don't know when and we don't know what. And so that's what suspense is, just giving us an idea that something is coming in the dark, but we just don't know when. Another sight that I noticed was the actors' facial expressions. And so on all of the actors' faces is visible fear. That fear that they are creating through their expressions are supposed to translate to us and kind of let us know that we too should be scared of what may happen in the clip. I'm also noticing sounds. One of the sounds that I noticed was these loud, sort of uncertain noises. We couldn't really identify what it was, but we knew it wasn't good. And with that type of sound, that's supposed to build the suspense and keep us interested in what might happen to this family. I also noticed that the background music was progressively getting louder. And if you watch any scary movie, you know that the louder the music gets, typically something happens when it gets to that peak loudness. So again, that's building up the tension and letting us know that in a minute we're about to see something. And then lastly, a technique that you may have missed is that this kid, the son, he made an incredibly careless mistake. Obviously, they're hiding from this beast or whatever it is, monster. And the dad gets injured, and the first thing that the kid does is opens his car door and screams, "Dad." Well, that draws attention to him. And so ultimately, authors and people who create movies have characters make really small, careless mistakes all the time throughout a horror movie or a horror book for the purpose of kind of escalating the problem and making things worse and having us as the audience be like, oh, what is wrong with that character? And so having a kid make a careless mistake was meant to build the suspense. And so I'm going to talk to you about some different suspense building techniques that authors use in books. So we just focused on videos, but obviously we're going to be reading a short text. And what I'm going to ask you to do in that short text is pay attention to all of the times when the author's intention was to build suspense. And remember, suspense building is techniques that an author uses to keep us on the edge of our seat and engage us in what is happening. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, and then I'm going to explain what you're doing for this assignment and then give you guys time to work. So the first suspense technique that authors use is called time constraints. This is where you're giving the character a limited amount of time to complete a task, leading to rising tensions. So for example, every time I look at this, I always think of the movie Saw. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that, but ultimately that movie is based around different people having to do certain tasks in a certain amount of time in order to live. And that is 100% a suspense building technique. If we're reading a book and we see that a character only has a certain amount of time to do something before, they die or, before things get really bad, etc., that is purposeful suspense technique. The next is high stakes situations. This is where an author puts characters in a high stakes situation that ultimately could lead to their death or injury. So if we're reading a book and we see that a character is having an experience that could eventually lead to their death, that is meant to build the suspense. Point of view. This is where the author gives readers the deep inner thoughts of either a victim character or a villain character. The purpose of this is when we hear someone's deep inner thoughts, we connect with them. And a lot of times in the horror genre, those inner thoughts are going to be fear or even evil, stuff that's evil. And for some reason, humans get engaged in that. And so being able to get that particular point of view of specific characters and the thoughts that they're having when they're engaged in, particular situations really helps us stay on the edge of our seat. The next is called foreshadowing. This is where the author drops hints that gives the reader an idea of what may be coming. E is called create dilemmas. So this is where an author of a horror story intentionally makes things more complicated in order to increase or heighten the stress or tension. And so an example of this would be like a person running through the woods trying to run away from someone who's coming after them, and they trip on a branch and sprain their ankle. Obviously, their current situation is already bad because they're running from someone or something, but now the situation is even more complicated because they have a sprained ankle. And that's going to make it even more difficult for them to get away, which makes us as the viewers or as the readers interested in what may or may not happen to them. F is careless mistakes. I did talk about that when it came to the video clip. This is where a character makes really poor decisions or careless mistakes that lead us to feeling a little bit anxious for them. G is describing a character's anxiety or fear with vivid language. This is where authors use descriptive details to help us understand just how scared or anxious a character may be feeling. If we know how scared or anxious a character is, then we're able to connect to that, and that really engages us, makes us interested in what's going to happen with them. H is using words to describe dramatic sights, sounds, or feelings. So obviously in a video clip, I was able to point out a number of different things that I saw and things that I heard that I thought were suspense techniques. When you're reading a book, you're not able to do that. But the author is supposed to do a good job in the horror genre of really giving us that descriptive language of what things look like and what things sound like in order to create suspense and fear. And then last is repeating words, phrases, or characters' actions. Sometimes in a story, authors will choose to repeat things, whether that's things that are going on or how a character's feeling or what they're saying. And sometimes that decision is intentional at engaging us as the reader. And sometimes it kind of interests us because we aren't really sure why it's being repeated right now, but we later find out. So it's sort of like foreshadowing, similar to foreshadowing, but just through repetition. So here's what we're going to do. Well, when you were at school on Friday, I gave you a packet. And that packet is a small excerpt from this book here, The Girl from the Well. And what we're going to be doing with this is I told you exactly where to start reading and where to end reading. And so your job before you come to school on Thursday is to read what I have given you in the packet. And that is like a small section from this book, The Girl from the Well. And as you're reading, I want you to use this list right here on slide 4 in order to help yourself start to identify the author's use of all of these different techniques. I will tell you, in the reading that I've given you, the author uses every single one of these techniques at least once, sometimes even repeating them often. And so what I need to see is, as you are reading, I want you to use this slide and I want you to underline or highlight different examples where you're saying, oh, the author's using a time constraint here because a character has a limited amount of time to do something. So you're going to underline or highlight examples of suspense techniques that you're finding in the text. And then off in the margins, you're going to label what technique that is. So let me kind of show you what I'm talking about. So this is the story that I gave you on Friday. I had you place a star where I wanted you to begin. Well, notice as I was reading, I was coming to 2 parts, at least here, and you're welcome to have these on your, on your packet as well. I noticed that the author here used a time constraint where things had to get done relatively quickly. So I underlined it, and then off to the side, I just identified the technique. So I said, oh, this is an example of a suspense technique. And then off to the side, I wrote, this is a time constraint. So again, I used this slide 4, and I kept referencing it to make sure that I was identifying the correct technique. As I read on, I noticed down here that it's talking about though her nerves are frayed and adrenaline shoots through her network of veins. That's telling me how scared she is. So I went back to my examples and I said, which one of these really focuses on helping us understand how scared a character may feel? And I noticed that it was G, describing a character's anxiety or fear with vivid language. So I underlined it and I wrote vivid language of a character's feelings. So really all you're doing on this reading is you're using the slide that I just talked about, all of the suspense techniques. You are underlining as many examples as you can find of all the different suspense techniques that this author is using, and then you are labeling them off into the margins. Being able to do this is going to be key by the time you are at school on Thursday, because we're going to be reading an even more challenging story where these are a little bit harder to find. So we've got to practice this with ones that are a little bit easier to find first before we can get into the more difficult stuff. When you come to school on Thursday, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is a quick write, where you are going to be using all of the different suspense techniques that you have underlined and identified to help you do a written response. So it's super important that you have this done by the time you get to school on Thursday. Again, directions are right here on this slide, and the techniques are right here on the slide before it. Lastly, if you did not get a paper copy of this reading, I have uploaded a digital copy that you could use the Cami extension to highlight and underline your examples and label them digitally. So if you're having trouble with that, you need to reach out to me ASAP before Thursday and ask for help. All right, guys, I will see you Thursday. Bye.